Okay, got that going. So last time we went over Plato's metaphysics. So let's actually, before we remind ourselves of Plato's metaphysics, let's really quick remind ourselves just broadly of the branches of philosophy. It's been a little bit since we've done this. So what are the three major branches of philosophy?
Metaphysics. Ethics.
Metaphysics is one. Say that again.
Ethics.
Almost. So, well, let's first say what they are as I go. So metaphysics, describe metaphysics for me. What is metaphysics?
Describing the universe, the physical universe?
Not necessarily the physical universe. That's physics. It's a subfield of metaphysics. Metaphysics is studying what exists in reality. And a metaphysical question would be, is the physical universe all that there is in reality, or is there more than just a physical universe? That's a metaphysical question. Physics can't answer the question, what goes beyond the natural laws of physics? Physics is just determining what are the natural laws that govern this universe and their implications. So it goes beyond physics, it's above physics. That's where it gets its name, metaphysics. So metaphysics is the study of reality. Fundamentally, what is there that exists? And then we have epistemology. Second branch. What's epistemology? That's one we'll be covering today.
Study of knowledge.
Study of knowledge. What can be known and how do you know? How do you come to know things and what can be known? And then the third branch, this one I won't expect you to remember the name of, is called axology. It's the study of anything that requires value judgments. And three subfields of that we're particularly interested in are ethics, politics, and aesthetics. Ethics, the morality of the individual; politics, the morality of the state; and then aesthetics, beauty, the study of beauty. Perfect. So we've gone through Plato's metaphysics. Next, we're going to go through his epistemology, studying what can be known and how do we know. But before we do that, let's remind ourselves of his metaphysics. What did he fundamentally say? So, quick reminder. Plato is out to construct an entire system of philosophy. So he's going to construct a metaphysics, an epistemology, politics, an ethics, and an aesthetics. A complete system, all coherent with each other. So he's out to construct a system of philosophy that does two things. One, vindicate Socrates in the belief of the good, the true, and the beautiful, with the capital G, T, and B. These are objective and absolute. And support Socrates' ethics. Probably should have put that there too. A bunch of his ethics is going to piggyback on what Socrates already had in place and just build on top of that. He loves Socrates' ethics. Second, we've got to do this in a way that answers Parmenides, Heraclitus, and the skeptics. The sophists, sorry. They'll later be called the skeptics. The sophists. I meant to say sophists. So if you're going to set up a metaphysics, you have to answer the dilemma posed to you by Parmenides and Heraclitus. And so what was Socrates' answer? Or not Socrates, what was Plato's answer? His answer is, in reality, what exists?
Shadows of the world of forms.
There's two worlds, right? So we have the world of forms, and then we have this world. So you know you, I guess. Or the world of particulars is usually how he refers to it. The world of forms and the world of particular objects. Down here in the world of particular objects, there's you, there's me, there's chairs. There's multiple chairs, and there's multiple people. Up here, there's forms of things. Up here, there is the madness form. There's the chairness form. These are actually forms up there. Down here, we see particular instances of death. Up here, there's a form of mortality. And if all men are mortal, then there's a connection between the madness form and the mortality form. Those are somehow connected up here. Anything that we can logically deduce down here exists as physical structure up here. So as physical structure up here, we have, for example, all our postulates of geometry. And since these two postulates together imply this theorem, that's something that actually exists in the world of forms, that new theorem. It's a new abstraction. It's a new universal. And so all these logical connections that you can make between things, all these theorems that you can prove in mathematics, they exist as actual structure in the world of forms. Down here, we have the particular instances of all those things. Actual physical concrete. So you got the world of forms, and you got the world of particulars. Now, how are these two related to each other? The world of forms projects itself into the void, creating the world of particulars. We're somehow 3D images of what exists up here. All these chairs in this room are somehow a 3D reflection, a 3D image, a 3D projection of the chairness form up here. So there's these two worlds. The world of forms, world of particulars. This world of particulars, you have the void, empty 3D space, and then this projected into the void, creating 3D objects. So there's two worlds. The world of the imperfect, physical, changing particulars, our world, the world of particulars, and then the world of perfect, non-physical, static universals, the world of the forms. Those two different realities. Now notice, what did Parmenides and Heraclitus say? Heraclitus says, change implies a contradiction, and if you allow contradictions, you can't know anything. Plato says, sure enough, all change happens down here, and there is no knowledge of what happens down here. We have opinion at best. So Heraclitus, you're right. Parmenides says, no. There's logic. Logic is about reality, and that gives us knowledge of reality. And Plato says, yep, you're right. Parmenides, you're talking about this. Parmenides says, where we have knowledge, nothing changes. Plato says, yes. Heraclitus says, change implies no knowledge. It implies contradiction. Plato says, yes. You're both right. Here's a system that works this out for you two. And the skeptics, the sophists, they said that since all our sensory data that we get is somehow dependent upon the apparatus and the actual object being viewed, it can't ever give us perfect information about the world. So the sophists, the skeptics, they said we can't ever know anything about this world. And Plato says, sure enough, we can't rely on our senses. What we can rely upon is our reason. And our reason enables us to see into the world of forms. And so we can know things. Yeah, it's not about this world, it's about this world. All knowledge is really about this world. We can only have opinions about this world. So, sophists, you're right. We can't know anything about this world. But that doesn't mean we can't have any knowledge. Yes, we can't rely on our senses to tell us about this world. But we don't rely on our senses to know anyways. We rely on our reason. Our senses can help, but we don't rely on them for knowledge. Our reason is what gives us knowledge. And our reason is about the world of forms. So, creating this complete metaphysics ready to answer all these guys. We already talked about that. The world of forms is projected into the void, creating the physical world. Just a metaphor and analogy. How that actual projection works, no idea. But that's what it is. And then the role the good plays in all this. Do we remember that the role the form of the good plays in all this? Everything comes back to the form of the good. So in your geometry class, you start out with Euclid's 5 postulates, right? You take those as assumptions and you see what they entail. You say, if these postulates are true, then eventually you get the Pythagorean theorem. It's all hypothetical though. How do you know that your postulates in geometry are actually true? And so what Plato thought is that actually so we apply reason to determine a thing's logical implications, but we can apply what he calls the dialectic method to work backwards down the chain. How do you know if a statement is actually true? You apply the dialectic method to it, the question-answer method to it. Someone wanted to know, did I have a definition of justice? What would Socrates do? He would put it through the dialectic method and see if the definition held up. And so that's how he tests these things. And Plato thought that you could somehow work backwards from those postulates. Maybe these depend on that postulate, this on this one, this on this one. But then ultimately all three of these things come back to one form. And there's one assumption, one form from which everything can be logically deduced. And that form he called the form of the good. In that sense, the form of the good is the cause for all knowledge. The reason that we can know anything is because of the form of the good. It's what connects everything together. So he says it's the source for all knowledge, but he also says it's the source for anything that happens in the universe. So how does that one work? Remember that he is a universal teleologist. Everything that happens, happens for a reason. Everything that happens, happens with some purpose in mind. So you are capable of having purposes in your own mind and capable of acting on those purposes. Every time you decide to act, every time you decide to do something, you have some good in mind. You're attempting to accomplish some good when you do that. And so everything that drives you to do a particular thing is in some sense something that you view as good. And what must all those good things have in common? The form of the good. So everything that drives you to make a particular decision, every time you try to carry out your purposes, it's always a form of the good that's driving you to do that. Secondly, you say, okay, that works very well for me, but what about all the natural laws that govern this universe? Remember his story of the demiurge. The demiurge came along and put things in order. The demiurge is basically the one who introduced natural law into the universe. He put the universe in such fine order that seems to follow all these rules. Remember, the demiurge had an eye to the world of forms when he put everything in motion. So that's why logic seems to work in this universe. It was the demiurge. And the demiurge had a purpose in mind when he did that. So everything that happens with the natural laws and everything that they cause to happen in this universe happens for a purpose. The purpose of the demiurge, which is targeted at some good. And everything that we as individual actors do in this universe, we again do it targeted at some good. So why does anything happen in this universe? Ultimately, for some good. And it's the form of the good that links all those. So the good is the cause for everything that happens in the universe, and it's also the reason that we can know anything about the universe. It operates in both those rules. That's the form of the good in his philosophy. Okay, so the good is the fundamental form, the reason for everything, and the source of our ability to comprehend anything. Serves both those rules. Note how closely related the good and the true are. What's true? Everything entailed by the good. That's what's true. All right, so with that recap of his metaphysics, let's jump into his epistemology. The study of what we can know and how do we know. So first question he has to answer is there objective and absolute knowledge? He's going to say yes, and he's going to try and demonstrate it, obviously, because it's going to be about the world of forms. Second, if there is objective and absolute knowledge, where does our knowledge of it come from? So he's got to answer both those questions. Now, we've already touched upon how he says this. Do you remember how we touched upon this?
On objective and absolute knowledge.
On how you know this objective and absolute knowledge. So he's going to say knowledge is about the world of forms. The world of forms is objective and absolute. Therefore, there's objective and absolute knowledge. But now, how do we know about objective and absolute knowledge?
We just remember.
It's a recollection process. So for him, you existed, your soul, since the soul is the essence of you, your soul is an essence here where essences exist. So your soul, which is the essence of you, existed up here in the world of forms prior to your birth. And so you simply come down here and now you recollect what you already knew. Now I'm going to try and give you a feel for this recollection process. I'm going to help you recollect that the sum of the angle in any triangle is 180 degrees. Now how many of you feel like you can stand up and prove this right now? None of you. Okay. Now without telling you anything, I'm going to get all of you to recollect the proof. That's what we're going to do now. So we're going to start out with some arbitrary triangle. Doesn't matter. Here's our triangle. Good so far?
Mm-hmm.
If I extend the lines of this triangle, does that change the triangle? So doing this, if I extend that, I extend that, I extend that, that doesn't change the triangle. Is there a line through this point parallel to this line? Can we put a line there through that point parallel to this line? Is it possible to construct such a line? Does constructing such a line change the triangle in any way? So this line then can be constructed parallel to that line. Okay, and how does this angle compare with this angle? They're the same. So you're saying that this angle is the same big as this angle? Okay, and how does this angle compare with this angle? They're the same. So you're saying that this angle is the same big as this angle? And how does this angle compare with this angle? They're the same. So you're saying that this angle is the same big as this angle? And what is the sum of these three angles?
180.
So what is the sum of these three angles?
180.
Look at that! I didn't tell you anything. And yet you just recollected all this. Without me ever saying anything to you. Right? I didn't tell you anything, and yet you just were able to pull this out of your own heads. It was already within you this whole time. You just need help recollecting it. Right? Similar example might be, you might not remember the games you played as a kid. I ask you, who was your best friend as a kid? And you might, after thinking, say, oh, my best friend was Bob. And I say, what did you and Bob do together? You say, oh yeah, we used to play tic-tac-toe all the time. That was my favorite game as a kid. And so through asking you some questions, I can get you to recall something that at first you couldn't recall. So you couldn't recall it. I start questioning you about some stuff, and then somehow you're able to recall it. It's amazing. Even if the knowledge wasn't in me, I can still get you to recall it.
Does that mean that Plato thought that you could never forget anything?
That you can never create anything?
Forget anything.
No, you can forget, and then you can recollect again. You forgot this proof, and now I helped you recollect it. And it's very likely that you'll forget this proof again. Just like I could help you remember that your favorite game as a kid was tic-tac-toe, and then a couple years later, you might forget all over again. I could help you remember all the people you went to high school with, and a few years later, you could forget all over again. And you have to go through some process of recollection.
So learning and remembering is like the same thing as far as Plato's concerned.
Yes, all knowledge is recollection for Plato. And hopefully this gives you a sense for how that goes, why he thought that. Okay, so yeah, if I didn't give you the knowledge, where did the knowledge come from? I didn't give it to you. Somehow you had it. It must have been there the whole time, right? What other explanation is there? Yeah, probably shouldn't have gone right there. All right, so in epistemology, Plato is primarily opposed to the sophists. The sophists were the ones who said you can't know anything, right? Remember Gorgias?
Yeah.
There's no such thing as reality. Even if there is, you can't know anything about it. Even if you couldn't communicate to anyone, so no sense even trying to talk about it. That's Gorgias. So that's what he's primarily opposed to, the sophists. He's out to demonstrate that objective and absolute knowledge is possible. Since all knowledge is about the forms, and the forms are objective and absolute, then knowledge is objective and absolute. Everything you learn is really about this. Remember that anytime you communicate information about something, anytime you tell me what you know, you do it in terms of these forms. If you were to tell me about Bob, you might tell me Bob's a plumber. That's a universal. You might tell me he's 5'10". That's universal. Everything you would tell me about him is these universals. So all knowledge is about these forms. And we already showed in metaphysics that these forms are objective and absolute. So all knowledge is objective and absolute. So then, if the forms are in another world, how did we ever come to know them? The answer, prior to birth, our souls existed in the world of forms. Here they came into contact with all the forms. What does that look like? No idea. This doesn't necessarily have dimensions of space and time. How things existed there, we don't know. But somehow, since our souls were there, they were able to have direct experiences of these forms. So we came in contact with the forms, and so we were omniscient, or at least potentially omniscient. Could potentially know everything that there was to know. I don't know, maybe it was possible to somehow not come in contact with them, even though they were right there. I don't know. But you definitely had the opportunity to come into contact with them, and everything you know here, you came into contact with first up here. That's for sure. So the process of coming into the body then must have caused us to forget everything we knew. It's a very traumatic experience for you. There you were, an omniscient soul, then you were put into this body, and whatever it did to you, you suffered a lot of trauma, and you forgot everything you knew, just about. So the process causes us to forget everything we knew, but we still possess these innate ideas on some level. The same way that you possess your memories of back when you were a kid or back when you were in high school on some level. Therefore, the process of learning is really just a process of recollection. That's all it really is. Now, next natural question is, what role do the senses play in attaining new knowledge? So Plato says you don't really learn anything from the senses. All knowledge is about the world of forms. You came here with those innate ideas, but the senses can still help. Since the senses expose us to imitations of the true forms, they can act as a sort of stimulus to help us recollect the form. So I'll give you an example. I have a little child. A dog comes along, and I tell that little child, look, this is a dog. Another animal comes along. I say, look, this is a dog. Another animal comes along. I say, look, this is a dog. And after a few instances, it starts to come back to her, and she starts to recollect dogness. And then I show her a new animal. I say, what is this? One that she's never seen before. And she says it's a dog. How on earth did she know that? No one ever told her that was a dog before. It's a completely new, different animal. And yet she knew. And so she didn't. After being exposed to a few instances, she then did. And so that's how she came to recollect it. Or the other example, the old high school friend example. So the way this typically goes, imagine that you're sitting there with your grandpa, and you have this old yearbook, and you just turn the page, and he sees something like a picture of the old gym building there. And after seeing the picture of the old gym building, he thinks, oh yeah, I used to be on the basketball team. Oh yeah, and I played basketball with this person, that person, that person. Oh yeah, we had this coach. And by seeing an image not even related to it, What does a gym building have to do with Bob, Bill, and Frank? Yet he's recollecting these people that used to be on his basketball team, Bob, Bill, and Frank. And so it's possible that our senses can stimulate us and cause us to recollect a few things, and by recollecting those few things, we can use those recollections then to start building new recollections. And I don't have to recollect everything directly. If I recollect Euclid's 5 postulates of Euclidean geometry, that is enough for me to then derive and recollect all the rest of geometry. I don't need any more experiences to stimulate my senses. So you need your senses to be stimulated enough to give you a connection into this web somehow. But once you get your connection to this web, you get stimulated in your mind this form, that form, and the other form. You can then start using those forms, reasoning about those forms, to then recollect new things. So logic is recollection. And it's rediscovering that structure that existed. Okay. Note that senses never communicate new information to you. They only help you to recall what you already knew. Everything you knew already innate within you. You just need some way to stimulate it. While the senses are necessary in obtaining an initial stimulus to help jog our memories, they are theoretically dispensable. Make sense?
How much do they understand the body anatomy, especially around the brain, during this time period?
They don't. In specifically, I think it's the Phaedo. They're talking about where is this process of recollection. You know, some people say it happens in the blood, some say the heart, some say the brain. So those were 3 things that they put forth, particularly in that dialogue.
So it's quite a debate where thinking actually comes from in our bodies.
All right, they didn't know what was the thinking element within us.
Yes.
But the brain was one of the things suggested. Anything else? All right. So once we have our initial recollections, we can begin reasoning about these recollections to new recollections. Once you get plugged into the web somewhere, you can start reasoning about those premises to come to new conclusions. Or you can work backwards down the web through what he calls the dialectic method. Since all the forms are logically related, they have that connection with them, reasoning about the forms reveals the structure of the forms. So when you reason about the forms, your mind's eye is actually seeing structure that exists there in the world of forms. Strong connection between what you reason and what actually exists in the world of forms. There's a one-to-one relationship there. This is actual structure that exists in reality. In other words, reasoning about the forms and perceiving the structure is one and the same thing. Since I can reason about triangles to the conclusion that their angle sum is 180 degrees, then the actual structure of the form's triangularity and 180 degreeness must have this relationship. So somewhere up here in the world of forms, if this one's triangularity and that one's 180 degreeness, there's actual structure that exists between them, since we're logically connected this way. So after an initial period of stimulating your memories, knowledge becomes then a process of looking inward, introspecting, or reasoning. There's no reason to go build bigger and better microscopes or bigger and better telescopes and to get better observations of this universe. Once you get enough sensory data to start the stimulating process, everything that you can know is innate within you somehow. And so you can get it through introspection. Notice that mathematics works this way. Once you give me the postulates of Euclidean geometry, it's theoretically possible for me to prove any theorem. But I can't, however, go lock you up in a room giving you some initial facts of physics and have you then derive some new field of physics. You can't get from Newtonian mechanics to quantum mechanics. That requires some new actual sensory data. But mathematics is very much the way that he's describing here, and maybe that's not too surprising that he thought all of reality was this way, with the stress he puts on mathematics. Anyways, so we are born with innate ideas, and we can reason about these innate ideas to obtain knowledge. And so Plato is what we call a rationalist. What was rationalism? Prior to Immanuel Kant, here's what rationalism meant. So I say rationalism in ancient times, but all the way up to Immanuel Kant. It's the theory that knowledge is acquirable solely through reasoning from innate concepts or ideas, and that sense perceptions are in principle dispensable. They may serve some practically useful purpose, but theoretically, you shouldn't have to have them. That's rationalism. Plato is a rationalist. Rationalism becomes a popular common school of thought throughout philosophy. And then in more modern times, it just becomes a more general form of this. We do away with the concept with innate ideas, and we also do away with there being any notion of sense perceptions. Some philosophers go so far as to say there's no such thing as sense perceptions. So in modern times, what's rationalism? It's a theory that reason rather than experience is a foundation of certainty and knowledge. So it's just a more general form of this. Potentially get rid of the innate concepts and potentially get rid of any notion of sense perceptions. But so Plato, he's this kind of rationalist. Okay. So what are our arguments for the existence of these innate ideas? We've already covered several arguments for the existence of these innate ideas. Just remind you of them really quick. Argument. Here's one argument, then give you some similar ones. We have to know universals before we can know particulars. Remember that argument? You have to know universals before you can know particulars. You might think you don't have to. You might think if you just show me enough dogs, then I can construct the abstraction dogness. And I can create a definition of dog from those particular instances. And so you can start with the particulars and then create the universal. Plato says no. Imagine I told you to give me the definition of food. You said, how am I supposed to do that? Give you the definition of food. I say, it's real easy. Go find a bunch of particular instances of food and abstract what they have in common. And then you give me the definition of food. You don't know which particular instances to go gather up. I first have to give you a definition of what food is for you to go find particular instances to abstract from. So you have to already have a definition before you can talk about particulars. So we have to know universals before we can know particulars. We cannot learn of universals from senses. We don't have any sense perception of universals. We only have sense perceptions of particular things. You never get a directly experienced animal. You can experience that particular dog, that particular cat, but you can't just show me animal. Don't show me a dog, don't show me a cat, just show me animal. I just want to see animal. That abstraction doesn't exist in reality. So we cannot learn of universals from our senses. And we do come to know particulars. You know your particular dog, your particular cat. The only way that you can know your particular dog is if you already knew dogness, because you have to know universals before you know particulars. So you have to know universals before you know particulars. We cannot learn universals from our senses, and we do know particulars. Therefore, we are born with knowledge of universals. Make sense? And then he does a similar type of argument for our knowledge of perfections. You have a knowledge of perfect equality or perfect justice. That knowledge is already within you in some sense. I can ask you, are these things perfectly equal? And you can answer yes or no. You have some notion of perfect equality already in your head. Have you ever seen perfect equality? Have you ever seen perfect links of wood? No, it doesn't exist in this universe. So you have knowledge of these perfections. These perfections don't exist anywhere in this universe. Where did you get the knowledge of those perfections? Must have been some innate idea you came to this world with. And then a similar argument for knowledge of abstractions. You know what it means to be a triangle, or what it means to be two, or what it means to be any type of these abstractions. Yet you've never seen a triangle. You might say, yes, I have. Look, triangle. That's not triangle. That's chalk on a whiteboard. A triangle is a two-dimensional figure. That has thickness. However thin, it's still thickness. It's chalk sticking out of the whiteboard. If I'm going to get a triangle, I've got to get rid of the thickness there. So let's get rid of the thickness. Now we're closer to a triangle. You've never actually seen a triangle, and yet you have knowledge of a triangle. You've never actually seen two. You might say this. No, these are fingers. Show me two. You might go grab a couple rocks. No, those are rocks. Show me two. So you never see these things. You never have a direct experience of them. And yet, you understand these things. You know these things. Where did you get your knowledge of these things? They must have been innate ideas. Now, Plato's most famous argument for innate ideas comes from the dialogue called the Meno. Now, Meno, he's some young proper youth from a city that's not Athens. He's coming and he's visiting Athens. Athens has this reputation for wisdom. He's coming there to learn. In particular, he's been taught by Gorgias. So, he's been taught by Sophist. And him and Socrates are having a conversation, and Meno asks Socrates something to the extent of, can virtue be taught? Socrates says, Meno, I can't even begin to answer this question. I don't even know what virtue is. And Meno makes fun of them a little bit. Oh, how shameful, Socrates. Here you are in Athens, which has this reputation for wisdom, and you don't even know what virtue is. And Socrates says, fantastic, Meno. Does this mean you know what virtue is? Can you tell me what virtue is? So engages him in this conversation. And so Meno, he gives him a bunch of examples of virtues. And Socrates says, that's great, but I didn't ask you for a bunch of examples of people doing virtuous things. I want to know what virtue is. And Meno says, well, virtue, that's temperance, justice, courage, wisdom. Socrates says, I agree that those are all good virtues. But what do they all have in common by which we call them virtue? What's the definition of virtue? And after a lot of back and forth, Meno finally comes up with the solution that virtue is in some sense managing your responsibilities justly. So someone who's given political power in a state, it's managing that power that they're given justly, carrying it out with justice. If you're wife of a man managing the affairs of the household, it's managing the affairs of the household justly. And as Socrates says, so we agreed that temperance, courage, justice, and wisdom were all types of virtue. And now you're telling me virtue is a type of justice. It's managing things in a just way. How can they both just be pieces of each other? It doesn't make sense. And that's kind of where the dialogue ends, never coming with a definition of virtue. But along the way, they have this question of whether or not virtue can be taught. Plato introduces it, or Socrates introduces Plato's idea that nothing can really be taught. So in demonstrating this to Meno, he says, I'll prove to you that knowledge is recollected and it's not really taught. So he says, Meno, bring me one of your slave boys who has never been taught geometry, but make sure they can speak Greek so I can talk to this boy. So the kid comes up. And Socrates starts talking to him. And Socrates says, I'm going to give you a figure here, which is a square, and I'm going to make it so that it's 2 units long on each side. And he asks the slave boy, what's the area of the square? The slave boy says, the area of the square is 4. Socrates says, fantastic. Now, what we want to do is build a square that has double the area, or in other words, has an area of 8. So how much should I extend this side to get a square that has an area of 8? And the slave boy says, that's easy, Socrates. Just double it. And Socrates says, very well, let's double it. And so we double the sides of the square. And when we draw in all the lines on the figure that Socrates draws in, he says, did we double it, slave boy? The slave boy says, yes. And he says, and what's the area of the resulting figure? And the slave boy says, 16. And so he points out to Meno, look at how the slave boy thought he knew for a second and now realizes that he doesn't know. He says, so slave boy, did we accomplish what we were trying to do? The slave boy says, no. He says, okay, so how much should I have extended this to get a square with the same amount of area? And the slave boy says, well, maybe we should have just done it by 1, and that would work. And so Socrates says, very well, let's do it by 1. Tell me what the area is. And he does it by 1, and he counts up the area, and he realizes that the area is only 9. We're looking for one with an area of 8, so that doesn't work. And the dialogue goes on. And with Socrates questioning him, he eventually gets the slave boy to describe this square to him. So I'll just give you the square, because I know you're dying with curiosity. So we'll go back to this figure. So our initial square is right here, right? We're looking for the square that doubles the area. And it turns out that that square is going to be this one, drawn on the diagonals. And so now this new square, count up its area. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Those two give us 1. So those two together give us 5. Those two give us 6. Those two together give us 7. And those two together give us 8. And so just through questioning, the slave boy is ultimately able to describe this square to Socrates. The square that has double the area of the initial square. And he says, you see, Meno, how much advancement this slave boy that's never been taught geometry just made in geometry? And yet I never told him anything. He just answered the questions and pulled this all out of himself. And so knowledge must really be recollection. So that's one of his more famous proofs for knowledge and recollection. The Meno, if you're interested. Go ahead.
So the world of forms is the world of universals, and I'm curious about this world of forms. Is the world of forms accurate and true?
Is the world of forms what?
True.
True. Knowledge is about the world of forms. When we say that all men are immortal, that means that there's some actual real structure that exists between the madness form and the mortality form. Everything that we call true here is physical structure that exists there. Physical, because they're not physical objects, but actual structure, real structure.
So the world of forms is a structure of what is true.
what we call true is what exists as actual structure in the world of forms.
Great. So, what I'm wondering is how can we explain a incorrect understanding about something in the world? Like if we come to the wrong conclusion, the wrong reasoning about something, that reasoning we never saw, we can't explain it, doesn't exist in reality. We came to it, we recollected it.
You misremember all the time, left and right.
Yeah, so
You misrecollect sometimes.
but we pulled it from the world of forms, which is supposed to be true and accurate. And
Well, no, you didn't actually pull it from the world of forms. The same way that you may not have actually pulled it from your memory. You can't pull false structure from the world of forms.
So where are we pulling it from? If it's not from the world of forms, and it's not from reality. The world
It's
of-
similar to misremembering, misrecollecting. You had a mistake in your thinking.
So it was just a mistake, even though we know the truth, we made a mistake.
You know it on some level. It's very hard to recall the truth. Most of the time you're wrong. That's the common state. Most of the time you're not recollecting that knowledge. It's very hard to actually recollect that knowledge. So there's nothing surprising about most of the time you give a false answer. I say, how many people did you graduate with? You say, I don't know, 25. That's most likely wrong. You didn't go through the pains of actually recollecting. So you have to go through that actual process of recollection to actually get the right answer.
So Plato's argument is that I actually do know the number of people who graduated, and I somehow,
You're being mentally lazy. You're not going through the pains to actually recollect that number.
I see.
And you're just spitting it out.
If ever someone's wrong, they're just meant to be lazy.
Exactly.
Got it.
They're not going through the pains necessary to come to know. Or it's possible that they're just making mistakes as they're going through the pains. Like Meno did, or like the slave boy did in the Meno. He kept giving wrong answers, but slowly narrowing in on the right answer. So nothing surprising about that. Okay. So a lot of Plato's epistemology relies upon the immortality of the soul, right? A large part of how we come to know things relies upon our soul being up here and existing there first. So since immortality of the soul is closely tied with his epistemology, we're going to go over some of his basic arguments for the immortality of the soul. Go ahead.
Is there a universal soul? Or just a particular soul?
So you get into, so he covers this in what is his Parmenides, where he's critical of his own theory. And basically, he introduces what we now call the third man argument. We'll cover this when we talk about Aristotle, because he also has his own version of it. But he'll say, do you and madness have something in common? Of course you do. And anytime two things have something in common, then that must be some form that they have in common. So you and madness must have some other form in common, called the third man.
Wait, what?
It's similar to what you're saying. Here's you. Here's madness.
Okay.
You and madness have something in common,
Yeah.
which means that there must be some universal that you both share,
Why?
which we call the third man.
Why?
That's what we mean by two things resemble each other. Same way that two chairs resemble each other. And then it goes on to, well, do you and the third man have something in common? Yes. And so you get this infinite regression. So this is one of the themes that he points out is the problem with his philosophy. Remember, he was critical of his actual system as he went the entire time. He never viewed it as a complete system. Or, it is a complete system in that it covers everything. It's not a finished system. It was still open to improvements. And so, yeah, you're touching on that exact same thing. Because the soul is somehow the essence of you. So the soul exists here. Now, do souls have some other essence that they share in common?
Gotcha.
And so, similar argument. So, yes. All right. So, arguments for the immortality of the soul. Argument from opposites in generation. The arguments I'm presenting here, they all come from the dialogue called the Phaedo. This is one where Socrates actually drinks the hemlock. Now, this is a Platonic dialogue, not a Socratic dialogue. So this is largely Plato giving his own philosophy. So major topics of the Phaedo are, of course, the immortality of the soul. You know, Socrates is there with all his friends. All his friends are afraid that when he dies, he's actually going to be gone for good. This is it. It's over. And they want Socrates to comfort them that, no, he's actually going to persist after this, and this isn't the end for him. So that's one of the major topics, and a bunch of topic about the afterlife and how he views that. Goes over cycles of reincarnation. He believed in cycles of reincarnation, much like the Pythagoreans, and that you can escape those cycles of reincarnation by becoming a true philosopher. So very similar there. But we're just going to focus on his arguments for the immortality of the soul, because it's very closely tied with his epistemology. So one argument he gives is arguments from opposites in generation. Observe that in generation, everything comes from its opposite. Now, that might sound weird at first, but for something to become bigger, it must have first been smaller. For something to become red, it must have first been not red. For someone to become awake, they must have first been asleep. And for someone to become asleep, they must first have been awake. The only way that you can generate some new property is if that property was not there to begin with. So what's the opposite of having a property? Not having a property. The opposite of it. So everything is generated from its opposite. That makes sense? Everything's generated from its opposite. Now observe that for someone to die, they must first have been alive. Right? And then so, if someone becomes alive, they must first have been dead. And so the living are generated from the dead. Reincarnation.
Well, what does he say it means to be dead?
Not alive.
And
I assume he's viewing them as negations of each other.
what does... Oh, okay.
But you're also touching on something here. So a lot of the confusion that we see in Plato's philosophy comes from conflating opposites with negations. Let me give you a quick example of that. What's the opposite of black?
White.
White. What's the negation of black? Not black.
Yeah.
Those are two very different things. There's a huge difference between white and not black.
Yeah.
So a lot of the logical mistakes that Plato makes in his arguments is he's conflating opposites with negations. And so Aristotle, when we get to him, he goes through a lot of pains to talk about all the different ways that we use that word opposite and what exactly we mean in those different contexts. Anyways, so then in order for someone to come to life, they must have first been dead. And so the living are then generated from the dead. Therefore, the souls of the dead must exist in some place from which they are reborn.
Are they dead then?
Well, can you be dead if you were never alive?
No.
And can you be alive if you were never dead? And so it's a cycle. Everything is generated from its opposite. So that's one argument for the immortality of the soul. All right. Argument from recollection of knowledge. This is the closest one tied to his epistemology, so this is one I'll try to flesh out the most and give you some of his actual verbiage.
Was that the last of his proof on the immortal soul?
That was one of them. So when you read the Phaedo, that's the first one that he gives. And then they're not happy with that, so he gives another one. And then they have problems with that, so he gives another one.
Because I'm not happy with that.
Okay. You're in the same position as most of them. All right. So, argument for recollection of knowledge. Observe that we came to recognize things as true through inquiry. Right? I take you through some inquiry, and you can come to understand that something is true. And that for any question, either you know the answer or you don't.
Can I kind of know the answer?
You either do or you don't. Well, he's going to say you kind of can. You'll see what he says here. If you already know the answer to the inquiry, then inquiry isn't necessary. It's a waste of time. There's no point inquiring about something you already know. And if you don't know the answer, then you'll have no way of recognizing the correct answer when it presents itself. Right? You have to already know what dogness is before you can identify something as dog. For if you don't know what the correct answer is, how will you distinguish it from a false answer? So, we must both know and not know. We must kind of know the answers to inquiries. We know, but we don't recall that we know. That's his solution. So, that knowledge is simply recollection also necessarily implies a previous time in which we have learned that which we now recollect. But this would be impossible unless our souls had been in some place before existing in the form of man. before we were right here in the flesh. Here then is another proof of the soul's immortality. Now, one of the people he's talking with says, no, that's only half the proof, Socrates. All you showed us is that the soul must have existed before birth. We're afraid that your soul's going to cease to exist after you die. You got to cover the second half of the argument. Maybe the soul existed before birth. How does that mean it exists after death? So about half of what was required has been proven. To wit, that our souls existed before we were born. That the soul will exist after death as well as before birth is the other half of which the proof is still wanting and has to be supplied. When that is given, the demonstration will be complete. So they're not letting Socrates off the hook here. Must we not, said Socrates, ask ourselves what that is which, as we imagine, is liable to be scattered and about which we fear? So we need to talk about things that are liable to be scattered, because you are all afraid that my soul's going to scatter after I die. It's going to blow away with the wind, and that will be the end of Socrates. And what again is that about which we have no fear? Things that aren't likely to be scattered. And then we may proceed further to inquire whether that which suffers dispersion is or is not the nature of the soul. Our hopes and fears as to our own souls will turn upon the answer to these questions. So we got to figure out if the soul is likely to scatter after birth or likely to still be there. How do you go about that? Things which are compound, composed of many parts, things which are compound, if anything, are capable of being dissolved. And things which are uncompound, only composed of a single thing or a single type of thing, if anything, are indissoluble.
How do they reconcile that with the atomist point of view?
With what?
The atomist point of view of constantly dividing things.
Of constantly dividing things, sorry.
The atomists.
So the atomists say everything can be dissolved into its component atoms. But the atom itself is simple. The atom itself is not compound. It's simple. And so it can't be split.
Right, but if you have an object made from atoms, it's still compounded, which means it can be dissolved. So wouldn't they be worried about his soul still being made of atoms that could be dissolved?
So that's the question here. Is your soul, like your body, composed of all these atoms that are going to disintegrate with time and break down into their individual pieces, their individual components? Or is the soul like a single atom? And you don't worry about a single atom decomposing out of existence using the atomist view, not our modern notions. So now, what is destruction? What is the destruction of an object if not reducing it to its component parts? That's what we mean to destroy something. It means to reduce it down to its component parts. Like he was saying, if we take the atomist view that everything is composed of these atoms, to completely destroy everything would be to separate off every single one of those atoms and get it completely broken down to its component atoms. That's destruction. So things which are uncompound, then, are indestructible. Things which don't have parts to them. They're just one single thing. It remains to show that the soul is uncompounded, as opposed to compounded, in which case it is not destroyed by death. So we need to show that the soul is more like uncompounded things than it is like compounded things.
So they don't think that you can make matter cease to exist.
The atomists didn't think you could make matter cease to exist.
Wouldn't that be a valid argument though? Why can't it just stop existing? What's stopping your soul from just ceasing to exist after you die?
If it's like, so, oh, I see what you're saying. So for Socrates, all the matter that existed in the universe was there in the beginning, and the demiurge just put it in order with an eye to the world of forms. So in that sense, yes, we don't have things coming into and going out of existence in his philosophy. You just break it down to their component parts. Okay, so yeah, in his philosophy, matter is not created or destroyed. It always was and always will be. Okay, so it remains to show that the soul is uncompounded as opposed to compounded, in which case it is not destroyed by death. Socrates points out that things which are compounded are liable to change, while uncompounded things are static. They don't change at all. Right? Go back to an atomist view of an individual atom. It never changes. It always and forever is the way it is. It might move around in space, but it never decomposes or anything like that. So, Socrates points out that things which are compounded are liable to change, while uncompounded things are static. All change is generation and destruction. Generation and destruction is simply breaking things down to their individual components, or putting things together from their individual components. Socrates then points out that physical entities are the entities that change, while non-physical entities tend to be more static. For example, you might find something in this universe that resembles a triangle. And it will change with time, no question. Anything in this universe will change with time, no question. But now think about triangularity. Does that change? If you prove that the angle sum of a triangle is 180 degrees 10,000 years ago, does the proof still hold now? Yes, because triangularity doesn't change. It's static. So that's what he means. So Socrates points out that physical entities are the entities that change, while non-physical entities, like the forms, tend to be more static. Then since the soul is not physical, it is likely to be more like the non-physical. And so it's likely to be more static. And if it's likely to be more static, it's likely to be uncompounded. Something simple. Then the soul must be less likely to perish as a result of death than the body. It must be less compounded than the body. It must be more like these static, unchanging things up here. Therefore, the soul is not destroyed by death because the body isn't destroyed by death. Or at least the body decays slowly after death. So he says, how likely is it if the soul is less compounded than the body, that right after death, my soul is scattered by the wind, and yet my body, it lays here, and it takes it forever to decompose and to go away. In fact, the Egyptians have been able to preserve bodies for extended periods of time. And he points that out as one of his examples. And so, if my soul is less likely to decompose than my body, and my body can be left to preserve for thousands of years, how are we justified thinking my soul is going to suddenly disappear in an instant? So, it's just a probabilistic argument, but therefore, the soul exists before birth and persists after death, and so the soul is immortal. That's the second one. Now, two objections are raised to this argument. The first one is, they say, well, Socrates, wouldn't your exact argument work for a harmony and a lyre? So, a lyre being an instrument that you play, and the harmony being what you play on the lyre. They say, obviously, the harmony can't exist before the lyre. The harmony being an analogy for the soul, the lyre being an analogy for the body. The harmony exists in the lyre in some sense. You play the lyre to produce the harmony. So they say, Socrates, wouldn't by your own reasoning and your own argument, could we be justified in saying that the harmony exists even after you destroy the lyre? There James is playing a song on a lyre, and I destroy the lyre. How ridiculous is it to think that the song continues on and the harmony keeps on going, even though he doesn't have the lyre? Because the harmony is one of these unseen things. And so wouldn't your argument work for this? Socrates points out, no, it's not a fair analogy. For two reasons. One, the harmony doesn't exist before the lyre. We already showed that the soul exists before the body. The other reason is the harmony is not a simple thing. It's composed of all these different notes, and it's going up and down and changing all the time. The harmony exists in time and space. You need time to carry out the harmony. And so he says this analogy doesn't work. Someone brings up another one. All right, well, let's think about a weaver and a coat. You say that the soul is more durable than the body. In like manner, a coat is more durable than a weaver. Right? A weaver, a human being, he exists for 80 years or whatever it is. His coats, they last a few years. He says, by this very argument, Socrates, you could say that after a man dies, you could say, nope, there's a coat he sewed, and we know that a man lives longer than a coat, therefore the man must still be alive. So maybe our souls are like you think, and we've gone through many bodies. And maybe this will be the one body that outlives us. The same way that a weaver goes through many coats, but there's eventually, if he's always making sure he has a coat, there's going to be one coat that outlasts him. So maybe, Socrates, you're on your last life. This is the last body that you had, and your soul is going to outlast, and this will be the body that outlasts your soul. That's the second argument that's right, or the second kind of one. This one he has a hard time doing away with. Has to come up with a whole new argument. I'm going to summarize it here. We're not going to go through it in depth. So he gives one more argument to do away with this. So he then adds one more argument that an object cannot contain opposite properties. An object cannot contain opposite properties. The example he gives is 3 cannot be both even and odd. Pick a number, it's either even or it's odd. Can't be both. Things cannot contain opposite properties. Pick an object, either it's red or it's not red. Can't be both. Now, notice that something dies the second you remove the soul from it. The second I remove the soul from you, you're dead. So soul must have the property of life. And so soul can't have the property of death. And so souls can't die. Now that's summarizing a much bigger, more elaborate argument, but trying to give you the high-level view of it.
Things Things can't change properties.
Okay, so since this instant we pull life or the soul out of you, then that property of life that was in you must have been in the soul.
Right.
When your soul and your body were together, it had that property of life. That's what was giving you the life property.
Right.
And so that life property is still somewhere. It can't be in you, because it can't be in your body because the body's now dead. And so that property of life is in the soul.
But I can take something that's red and I can paint it blue. So.
But the redness is still there somehow. You just put a coating over it.
Yeah.
So that's roughly how his third argument goes for the immortality of the soul. Okay, so next we're going to move on to Plato's, what's called his divided line. This is how we're going to talk about how we come to know things. So observe that there is a difference between knowledge and ignorance. We have knowledge about what is, right? That's going back to one of his earliest premises. What's knowable must in some sense exist. All knowledge is about reality. So what is ignorance about? If you're completely ignorant, what do you know? Nothing. Now think about that in the positive sense. You know nothing. Okay. You have to do this kind of wordplay to follow some of these Greek thinkers when they introduce nothing. So knowledge is knowledge about what actually exists. Ignorance is about nothing. So knowledge is about being what is, and ignorance is about not being what is not. It's about nothing. Also observe that there is a state in between knowledge and ignorance, which we call opinion. Right? And sometimes opinion is true, and sometimes opinion is false. Sometimes opinion is about what is actually the case, and sometimes opinion is about what is not the case. Right? If it's about what is the case, then it's about reality, what is, being. And if it's about what is not the case, then it's about nothing. So opinion exists in between knowledge and ignorance. You with me so far? Mm-hmm. This is an important piece of it. So then, opinion is both about being and non-being. Now what do we know in Plato's philosophy that has both being and non-being? That both kind of is and kind of isn't? What's being in Plato's philosophy? The world of forms. Here's being. What's non-being? What's nothing in Plato's philosophy?
The world.
The void. And when we take the forms and the void and we somehow bring them together, what do we get?
The world of particulars.
The world of particulars, this world that we occupy. We are the world of forms being reflected into non-being.
This is void, does he refer to like three-dimensional space?
Yes, empty three-dimensional space. Same way the atomists were using it. He's piggybacking on the atomists there.
So this world is opinion.
Sorry, what?
This world is opinion.
So all knowledge of this world is opinion at best. So you can only have opinions about this world. Because opinions are being and non-being. Knowledge is about the world of forms. Ignorance is about nothing. Opinion is about what is and isn't. This world, the world of particulars. So recall from metaphysics that the world is a mixture of being and non-being. It's the forms, or being, reflected into the void, non-being. And so, in the same way that knowledge is about the world of forms, so opinion is about this world. So Plato's divided line. Now, how do we recollect all of our knowledge? How do we come to actually learn things and improve our knowledge and build upon our knowledge as we go up and up? And he introduces this figure of the divided line. Now, I'll try and give it to you from a high level really quick. He's going to have us going up in knowledge. You come to know these things and these things and these things and these things. You start out by just having opinions, and then you're going to come to have knowledge. These two are going to be about opinion. These two are going to make reference to our world, our universe. These two categories are going to make reference to the world of forms. These are going to be about knowledge. So he's going to say, first we come to know the world of images, which are paintings, sculptures, shadows, reflections, theaters, fictions, something like a unicorn, where you take images of two particulars and somehow juxtapose them on each other. Not juxtapose them, but what's the word I'm looking for?
Combine.
Yeah, it's when you think you transpose them, so that one's on top of the other. Okay. Sorry. So that's world of images. First thing you come to know. Images of things. Then we come to know things themselves. Tables, dogs, trees, cars, birds, etc. So first we know the images of things, then we come to know things themselves. Here's what we have opinion about. Once we know enough things, we come to understand the universals of those things, like numbers, shapes, tables, chairs, chairness. After seeing enough chairs, you come to know chairness. And then finally, knowing enough universals, you're eventually able to go through the dialectic process, back down from your postulates, and come to know the form of the good. And then in that sense, you are potentially omniscient. Because once you know the form of the good, everything can theoretically be derived from the form of the good. The same way that everything in Euclidean geometry can be theoretically derived from Euclid's postulates, everything that can be known can theoretically be derived from the form of the good. So the ultimate goal of knowledge is to come to understand this form of the good. Here's what we're all out to do. So, how do we recollect all of our knowledge? To do so, we must pass through 4 phases. First, imagination, then belief, then intellect, and then finally, reason. That's the name for these 4 stages that we go through. The first 2 are opinion only. Imaginations and beliefs are about opinions. And then the second 2 are knowledge, intellect, and reason. Note that ignorant doesn't show up, since it's impossible for us to be completely ignorant. It's impossible for you to have no exposure to any images or any particulars. So you must at least have some opinions.
Is not having an opinion classified as an opinion? Or knowing that you don't know classified as
To be
knowing
completely
something?
ignorant, you would almost have to be in a constant state of thinking nothing. I think. So we're going to go through each one of these 4 categories and take you through the evolution of coming to know. And at the same time, Plato also associates a type of ethics with each one of these categories and a type of person who loves each type of these categories. So we're going to go through a deeper dive into each of these 4 categories. And we're going to work our way up. So we're going to start with imaginations. So looking at imagination. This is the stage of a child. You take all superficial appearances at face value. Everything you see is exactly what it is. You mistake images for real objects. Shadows, reflections, and artistic figures are mistaken for real objects. A child might see a painting of something and think that that's actual real. The child might see a reflection of someone and think that that's actually a real person. It's real easy to confuse that child. They're at this level in going up the scale. They just recognize these images. They're not to the point where they can recognize particular objects as objects yet. The ethics Plato associates with this level of thinking is one which just in the moment, for moment, pursues pleasure and avoids pain. Right? Very surface level type ethics. What should you do right now? You should do whatever will produce pleasure for you right now. What should you avoid right now? You should avoid whatever would produce pain for you right now. This is the way a child's ethics is. If I give a child a piece of candy, they'll eat it. I give them another piece of candy, they'll eat it. I give them another piece of candy, they'll eat it. They're never thinking to themselves, this is bad for my health. I probably shouldn't consume this candy. Their ethics doesn't go that far. They just want pleasure. I take the child to the doctor. I say, you want them to stick this needle in you? It's going to give you this vaccine. They say no. They want to avoid the pain now. They can't think ahead. This is the type of ethics that he ascribed to the sophists. They're saying, what should you do right now? Whatever seems good to you right now. You should behave like that child behaves. Always pursuing your pleasures and avoiding whatever brings you pain. That's the ethics of the sophists. Now, what are lovers of imaginations? People who love this category of knowledge. Now, remember that philosophy is the love of wisdom. So your philosophers are going to be the ones who love the top. So, got to set that framework where he's at the top. So, lovers of imaginations are your painters, your sculptors, your actors, etc. And their many fans. These are the people who love and enjoy imaginations and imitations more than the actual physical objects that they represent. What's the knowledge he associates with this level? Analogy to help you understand it is consider the level of knowledge an artist needs of a car to paint it. How much do you need to understand about a car to just paint the car?
Not a lot.
Not a lot of knowledge about that car. You don't need to know what's going on under the hood, anything about the tires, anything about thermodynamics, nothing. You just need to know how it just looks. You just need the image of the car, and that's enough for you. So then we go to the next level. This is a stage of an experienced person. Someone who's been around the block a few times, and they've had a lot of experience with a lot of particular objects. So, stage of an experienced person, you discover as a rule of thumb that general patterns seem to hold. You don't know why they hold. You don't know that if they will always hold, but they seem to hold. You've known enough people who were a good deal older than you, and they all seem to die. And so you come to the generalization, all men must be mortal. It's not that you did some deduction and came to that conclusion. You just noticed it as general pattern. Or maybe you were out there measuring some triangles and you said, the angle sum of this seems like it's about 180. The angle sum of this seems like it's about 180. Never actually go through the proof that that's the case always. You're just noticing general patterns. So you can tell the difference between images and objects. You've made some generalizations from your empirical observations of objects, but you do not know whether or not your generalizations are true or false. So you don't have any actual knowledge yet. You just know patterns that seem to work for the most part. And so you stick with the patterns that seem to work. The ethics he associates with this is a person who tries to pursue those things that he knows he should try to pursue. Temperance, courage, justice, wisdom. He's the layman. He doesn't have this elaborate system of ethics. He can't give you a definition of courage or justice or wisdom. But he's seen enough just acts that he says, I know I should try to imitate those. And he's seen enough temperate things to know I should try to imitate those. Lovers of objects are your artisans, your mechanics, your plumbers, your welders, etc. These are the people who have a sort of general understanding of the objects they work with and how to get them to function as desired. But they don't know the ins and outs. So your mechanic, he may not know all the laws of electricity and magnetism governing that battery that he works with, but he knows how it has to be hooked up for the car to go. He may not know exactly what the laws of thermodynamics are, but he knows that somehow the fuel has to get over here to the pistons. So he understands these general patterns, even if he doesn't have the knowledge. So consider the level of knowledge a mechanic needs to fix a car. So we got the person painting the car, their level of knowledge, then we got the level of knowledge the mechanic needs to fix the car. Now we go to the next level. The next level now is the first level of actual knowledge. This is the stage of an expert. You understand the basic premises of your field and all the knowledge that these premises entail. Or at least how to determine the knowledge that the premises entail. Maybe it goes on forever, but you know how to go through this process. Not only do you recognize objects, but you have an understanding of the forms by which these objects are related. You can begin to prove your generalizations true from some set of premises. You now know that this is always the case. You don't say, it seems to generally hold that triangles, when you add up their angles, it comes out to about 180 degrees. You know that's always the case, 100% of the time. No question about it. You begin to have knowledge of these generalizations. What's the ethics he associates with these people? These people actually now have definitions for these things. They understand what temperance is. They understand what courage is, justice is, and wisdom is. So what you say is now you got your moral man. What are the lovers of the forms? These are your scientists and your mathematicians. There are those who work directly with abstractions or these forms. They not only understand the objects, but they begin to understand how objects are related to each other, or how the different forms are connected. So they now start to see this world and understand some of the structure of this world. Consider the level of knowledge that a physicist would have of a car if they were to completely design from scratch. They need to understand all the thermodynamics. They need to understand all the electricity and magnetism. They need to know everything that there is to know about that car. And then finally, we get to the top level, the stage of reason. This is the stage of your philosopher. You can now understand the form of the good. You don't just understand some of these forms and work with the structure from there. You understand this form, the bottom form, the one from which you can deduce everything somehow. So the stage of the philosopher, you come to understand the form of the good via the dialectic. Remember, you can take your premises and reason about your premises to come to conclusions, and that's something you could write down in a book. The dialectic method, we're never going to get Plato to tell us, here's how you go through the dialectic method, because it's not something you can write down. It has to be this question and answering method over and over again, trying out each of your hypotheses working backwards, recognizing, yep, they're true by putting them through the dialectic test, and seeing what must have been true to somehow get there. So it's working backwards down this way. So taking the premises of other fields as hypothetically true, and then working backwards from them to ultimately get to the form of the good. You no longer start your proofs from some set of premises. You are able to deduce all knowledge from a single form of the good. You go back to geometry. We say if the postulates are true, then the conclusions are true. Once you're a philosopher, you no longer say if the postulates are true. You say I know the postulates are true. Look, here's how you deduce them from the form of the good. So it's no longer even hypothetical. What's the ethics of this person? This is someone who knows virtue itself and how it's derived from the form of the good. Got that perfect understanding of behavior now. Since all truth follows from the form of the good, you now comprehend how all the various fields are united. In other words, how the premises of geometry, of physics, and ethics are all being derived from the form of the good. They're all somehow connected. And so you don't anymore have these different various fields. All fields are somehow all connected to each other with this one form. And that's the level of understanding that your philosopher achieves.
Is this stage of a philosopher like a hypothetical situation, or did he believe that this has been achieved either by himself or others?
That is a good question. I think he thought that he had actually achieved this and was working to deduce these things out. Now, why wasn't he omniscient? Remember, if you know the form of the good, you're only potentially omniscient. You just have the starting form from which you can deduce everything. You need enough time, effort, and energy to put into it to actually deduce all the things that you want to deduce. So I think he thought that he had actually gone through this process, and I think people at the academy thought that they had actually come through this process and come to know the form of the good, because he describes what the experience is like. And we'll go through his Allegory of the Cave, which is where he gives his best allegory for what coming to know the form of the good is like. Anyways, know how each stage gives an explanation for the previous stage. When I say each stage gives an explanation for the previous stage, I mean, if you want to understand this, its explanation comes from here. If you want to understand this, its explanation comes from here. If you want to understand this, its explanation comes from here. So, give you examples of those to help it be understood. So, once I understand an object, I can come to understand the images. Here's one analogy given to you. Imagine that you exist in some other universe, and I somehow poofed you into this universe. So you had no experiences of this universe, but you know how to reason and logic and communicate and all that stuff. And for some reason, you're formed in such a way that you can only see the shadow of a tree and the images I show you. So first I have you watch the shadow of a tree. And you notice something very strange. You know, the shadow of the tree, in the morning it starts out long, and as the sun goes up, I guess I'm going the wrong way, the sun's over there. Shadow of the tree is really long, and as the sun goes up, the shadow gets smaller and smaller until it's teeny, and then it gets longer and longer, it grows, and then it gets dark, and the shadow's gone. And then it happens again. That shadow of the tree being one of the images of the tree. So I show you that shadow of the tree, and you sit there and you watch it, you can study it all you want. And I also show you a reflection of the tree in the water, and I also show you a painting of the tree. So 3 different images of the tree. And I say these are all somehow the same object. You say, how on earth are these the same object? First off, this thing that you were showing me over here, it was just black, and it kept growing and shrinking and growing and shrinking. That static thing in the pond over there, the reflection one, you know, that was all distorted and whatever, and it had all these different colors. It wasn't the same colors as the shadow thing. And then, you know, the painting is somehow different from them as well. How can you say that these are all the same things? And after looking at all those different images, if I then showed you the tree, then you come to understand, oh, these were in fact all the different trees. And I can see how that reflection in the water is really just a reflection of the tree. And I can see how that shadow was really just the shadow of the tree. Similarly with the painting or the picture or whatever. And so once you understand the object, you then understand all the images that you were seeing of the object. So you want to understand all the various images, get to know the object. That's what we mean here. Similarly, once I understand a form, I can understand all its particular. Imagine manually measuring the angle sums of a bunch of different triangles and seeing, it gets close to 180, it gets close to 180, it gets close to 180. Why is this the case? It's amazing. Every triangle I seem to go find, it seems like it's coming out about 180. But maybe there's secretly some triangle out there that's not 180, and I just got to go find it. Got to go on the hunt. But then when you come to understand this proof that we already did, then you understand, oh, this is always the case. And so if you want to understand a bunch of particulars, you need to understand the form. You want to understand a bunch of particular triangles, you need to understand triangularity. The form is how you understand a bunch of particulars. And then similarly, you want to understand your different forms, your different premises for like Euclidean geometry. Well, the way you do that is you get the form of the good. And with the form of the good, you can ultimately deduce it. So that's what it means there. So, and then once I understand the form of the good, I can supposedly derive any field's premises, including the postulates used in geometry. And so I can come to understand all the forms in geometry. So every level is completely explained every lower level is completely explained by its higher level. Okay, and so now we're ready for the allegory of the cave. And so here's the allegory Plato gives you to try and understand all this. He says, imagine that you were from birth born into this cave. This cave is deep underground, no sunlight gets into this cave. In the back of the cave, there's a dim fire back here. Now, you are chained up such that you are facing the back, and you're chained up in such a way that you can't get up, walk around, you can't even move your head side to side. All you can do is sit there and you can face this back wall. And you got this fire going behind you. Similarly, or on top of that, the cave, the acoustics in the cave are such that anytime you talk, it seems like it echoes off in the back and comes back to you that way. So you can't tell that when this person's talking, they're to your left. All the sounds seem like they come from the back of the cave. So here it is. So first off, you see your individual shadows. He says, first thing, you're not going to think that you're this physical thing. You're going to think that you're your shadow. You're going to come to recognize the shadows, and you're going to call the shadows physical objects. He says, now imagine that your captors are going to toy with you. They're going to go back and forth all day, holding sculptures or things that look like objects. So like a sculpture of a horse, a sculpture of a dog, a sculpture of a cat. And they're going to haul it back and forth on this pathway, and it's going to cast its shadow over here onto the wall. And he says, you're in your society, you're going to sit here and you're going to look at these shadows, and you're going to think that they're actual real objects. So you're going to see that shadow of the sculpture of a horse, and you're going to say, oh, that's a horse, that's a dog. You'll come up with your own names for these things, you'll talk about these things. The experts in your society will be experts at talking about and classifying these shadows. The ones who are best at predicting that after you see the horse shadow, next comes the dog shadow. Those are going to be your experts. The ones who come to know and understand these shadows. So that's your whole existence, and you think these shadows are reality. Now he says, imagine one of your captors comes to you, and he releases your chains. He says, at first this is going to be a very painful process for you as you get up and you start to move around this cave. Your joints are going to be all stiff. It's not going to be a comfortable process. And if you were to try and look directly at the fire, even though it's a dim fire, at first it might seem bright to your eyes and hard for you to take in that. But with enough time, you'll come to understand everything that was going on. You'll realize these shadows on the back of the wall aren't real. It's these objects over here, these sculptures that they made that our captors were driving back and forth, that were the real objects. And eventually you'll come to understand that these are somehow just shadows of those real objects, and these are the real objects that we're talking about. And Plato, and then your captor will say, that's all well and good, but you haven't seen anything yet. We're going to go up out of the cave. And so your captor is now going to take you up out of the cave. So here's representation of the cave. There they are, looking at, identifying all these images, calling the shadows real. You come up out of the cave into our world, the real world, up here. Now, what must this experience be like for you after that big climb? First off, it's going to be way too bright for you. He says it's probably more likely that you're going to be comfortable at night than you are at day. And you're probably going to be more comfortable with the shadow of a tree than you are with an actual tree, or with the images of things than with the actual objects. But slowly, over time, you will come to get more comfortable with the actual objects out here in the real world. You'll understand that these imitations that your captors were showing you down in the cave actually just represented real objects that existed out here in the real world. There you just saw that imitation of horse. You'll come up here and you'll experience an actual horse. So you'll go around this world and you'll see all the good, the beautiful things, and you'll come to understand everything. That you can see all the particular objects in this world. And when you get comfortable with it, you'll finally be able to handle going and identifying the sun. And you realize that the sun is the cause of all of this. Everything that happens in our world. All generation, growth, whatever it is, everything good that happens in this world ultimately is caused by the sun. Similarly, the sun is the reason that we can know anything in this world. Because the sun casts its light on it. You might say at night, well, don't you create a fire and that can show you things? Well, yes, but the fire had to come from trees, which you ultimately had to grow due to sunlight. So even that fire you get from the sun is somehow stealing the sun's light. And so the sun is the cause of everything good and beautiful that happens in this world. And on top of that, it's because of the sun that we can come to know anything in this world. So you come and you have all this knowledge, all this experience, and you can't wait to go tell your old friends about it, those buddies down in the cave. So you go back down in the cave, and you're going to tell your friends about this great world up here. So you come and you tell them. You say, these shadows that we're all looking at, these things don't matter. They're nothing. There's a much better world up here. It's going to be a pretty painful process for you. We're going to have to go, and it's going to be a big hike. But it's going to be this great, amazing world. And they say, well, tell us what the world's like. So, I can't explain it to you. In terms of the concepts that you have, it is undescribable. You just have to see it for yourself. There's no way that I could put this in writing for you, a nice little piece of paper, or some nice little proof for you, that you can read and say, oh yes, this is what I'm going to experience. You have to have this experience yourself. Now, what are your captors going to do? Or not your captors, what are your old friends going to do? First, they're going to test you. Is this man crazy? They're going to say, let's see if you still know anything. What's that shadow? What's that shadow? And you'll say, it'll probably be hard for you to see. I mean, it's just a dim fire. You were just out in the sun. Look at those shadows. I don't know. I can't really recall. I don't remember what those shadows are. But they're just shadows. They don't matter. Who cares? Trust me. We're talking about much better stuff. You're going to say, look at this guy. They took his chains off. They took him up there. He comes back down. He can't even identify these shadows that he used to identify anymore. And furthermore, he's saying that they're not even real. This guy's going nuts. We can't go with him. And he might persuade some poor youth that they should go with him, and they'll be just as messed up as he is. He better quit trying to get us to go up here. If he doesn't quit it, what are we going to have to do? We're going to have to sentence him to death. Obviously, Plato was making reference to Socrates, telling you, don't worry about this world. The important stuff, it's a whole other world. Stop focusing on, the money, the wealth, whatever. Focus on the more important thing, your soul. So, that's his allegory of the cave. He explains what each piece of the allegory means. So the shadows in the cave, those represent images. The objects in the cave that they were walking back and forth and to use to cast a shadow, those represent the particulars of our own world. The fire at the back of the cave, that represents the sun. And then the cave represents our world, the world that we live in. The objects outside the cave, those are the forms. The sun, that's the form of the good. And then finally, the world is the world of forms. So that's his allegory, to try and give you a sense for what this form of the good is. Because as he was talking in the Republic, this all comes from the Republic if you want to read it. They're asking him, what's this form of the good? And he's trying to say, unfortunately, I can't tell you. The best thing I can do is give you an allegory. So that's his best attempt at trying to explain what the form of the good is. Any questions about that? Because that pretty much ends his epistemology. Okay, how are we feeling? We want to start on ethics. I have about a half hour if we want to go, but I know epistemology can also be kind of a lot. How are we feeling? End here, pick it up here next time, or want to keep going?
How long is ethics?
We won't get through all of it today, but we can start if you wanted.
Let's do it next time.
Do it next time? All right. So we'll end it here, end with epistemology. Next time we'll get into ethics. We're going to start by talking about Socrates' ethics. We didn't do a deep dive when we were covering Socrates into his ethics, because Socrates' ethics and Plato's ethics are the same. It's just here's Socrates' ethics, and here's Plato's ethics. He just takes Socrates' ethics and extends it. So we're going to start by talking about Socrates' ethics, and then talk about what Plato for sure adds on, because it's one and the same. But yeah, so we'll end it here. That's his epistemology. We'll start ethics next time. Any questions you want recorded before we call it? Okay, see you next time.
Thank you.